British played a significant part in the Atlantic slave trade. It helped to transform the British economy. However, when asked about its role in human trafficking, the Brits played down the part they played and often seek recognition for stopping it. But did the British Empire really abolish slavery after building their empire on the profits made from the obscene trade? In this 10th session of the series, Time for the Nations to Reap, we will look at Britain and its connection to the European slave trade. I want to begin with the history of the relationship between Portugal and Britain that dates back to the Middle Ages. What may be surprising to most is that Portugal is actually England's oldest ally. In 1373, the Kingdom of England signed the Anglo-Portuguese Alliance. It's the oldest alliance in the world that's still in effect today. Let's read some excerpts from this article entitled History's Unparalleled Alliance, the Anglo-Portuguese Treaty of Windsor, 9th May 1386. The article says Winston Churchill, in a speech in the House of Commons in October 1943, famously described the unique and ancient friendship between England and Portugal as an alliance without parallel in world history. It says it is 630 years since a treaty of alliance between King Richard II of England and King John I of Portugal was ratified at Windsor on the 9th of May, 1386. Though it is not the earliest of the Anglo-Portuguese treaties that survive, the Treaty of Windsor is significant because it effectively cemented and strengthened ties between the two kingdoms and helped convert a fledgling alliance into a more permanent legacy of history. The terms of the treaty included provisions for guaranteeing the mutual security of both nations and strengthening of commercial ties, such as the right of both countries to trade on the terms enjoyed by the subjects of that country. There were even clauses encouraging freedom of movement and settlement between the two countries, as subjects of either country had the right to dwell in the domains of the other. So Richard II of England and John I of Portugal made this alliance with each other. Are we seeing the progression of the Confederation of Nations that worked to cut Israel off from being a nation? The descendants of those nations would later form alliances with other Gentile nations to continue on with the plan. So let's look at how this alliance began. So this article comes from historicuk.com. It says, on 9th May 1386, the diplomatic alliance between Portugal and England was ratified by the Treaty of Windsor. The oldest peace treaty in Europe was finalized through the marriage of King John I of Portugal to Philippa of Lancaster. The guarantee of support and mutual understanding between the countries survived centuries of upheaval, conflict on the Iberian Peninsula, and the engagement of both parties in numerous wars. The historic relationship was cemented back in 1386 and preserves or perseveres to this day. It says the foundations of this special alliance can be traced back to the Middle Ages. The English had initially intervened and offered support to the Portuguese crown back in 1147 with the siege of Lisbon. The king at the time, Afonso Henriques, was offered support from the English in order to conquer Lisbon and take the city from the Moors, which he eventually achieved with a little help from his northern counterparts. The English soldiers had been on their way to the Holy Land in order to wage war as part of the Second Crusades. In giving their assistance, the English and Portuguese first began to see each other as friendly European neighbors who could come to support one another in times of need. Now, one of the first things I noticed when I looked at the picture is how dark King John is compared to the woman he's about to marry. It may seem odd until you hear what Napoleon had to say in his memoirs. Let's take a look at that. So this is coming from Memoirs of Napoleon, his court and family. And this was written in 1836. I have the link here for those who like to study along with me so that you can go back and look at this on your own. Now, this information is found on page 90 of this volume, volume 2. And I enlarged the bottom of the page because I'm going to read what was written in the footnotes. Napoleon is describing what he saw when he arrived in Lisbon. It says, on entering Portugal from Spain, the traveler is forcibly struck with the difference between the two countries. He's describing the difference between the people in Spain and Portugal. He says the dark eyes, the black hair, and brown complexion are the only traits of resemblance between the Portuguese and Spaniards. So both groups have dark eyes, black hair, and brown complexion. But he says the Portuguese have thick lips, noses something of the Negro form, black and often curly hair, and their figures, and above all their hands, show signs of the mixed blood. In Spain, the people, in spite of their dark complexion and eyes, have at least a European look. Let's keep going. Let's go on, and this information is coming from page 107, and again, I have highlighted on the right the portion that I'm reading. It says, the men are not handsome in Portugal. There is among the Portuguese a sort of mixed blood, which gives them very much the appearance of mulattoes. This is particularly observable in Lisbon and Oporto. The fact may probably be accounted for by the frequent intercourse maintained by the inhabitants of those two cities with the Negroes. Now, if you remember when I did the live session called What is Portugal Trying to Hide? I went through the blood types of the Indo-Europeans, and we saw a mixture of E1B1B. So that would explain why he's seeing the Negroid features. Not to mention that I also covered information that said when the Indo-Europeans came down from the Caucasus Mountains, they were genociding the men and mating with the women to increase their numbers. So Napoleon is interacting with the nobility in Portugal and describing what they looked like. Now, we know that Portugal became extremely wealthy from the slave trade, but let's see how the British monarchs profited as well. We're looking at this article from The Guardian entitled The British Kings and Queens Who Supported and Profited from Slavery. It says King Charles III and Prince William have expressed profound sorrow at the atrocities of slavery, but neither has publicly accepted the Crown's central role in the trade. Over a period of 270 years, 12 British monarchs sponsored, supported, or profited from Britain's involvement in slavery. So the first is Elizabeth I. It says the Tudor queen gave a large royal ship to the slave trader John Hawkins in 1564 in exchange for a share in the profits of the voyage. On the trip, Hawkins captured many African people and seized 600 more from Portuguese ships, according to Nick Hazelwood in his book The Queen's Slave Trader. The next is James I. The first Stuart king granted royal connected merchants a monopoly on trade with Africa. They formed the Guinea Company, which provided enslaved people for English-owned tobacco plantations in Virginia, America, according to Peter Fryer's book, Staying Power. The next is Charles I. It says the king granted a monopoly license to the reconstituted Guinea Company in 1632 to transport enslaved people. English colonies were established where the economies were based on the exploitation of enslaved people's labor, beginning with Barbados, the first black slave society in 1636. Now we'll look at Charles II. He made the slave trade a state-sponsored enterprise, and he invested in a slave trading business called the Company of Royal Adventurers of England that traded into Africa, and he gave it a royal charter. When the company was dissolved in 1672, the king moved his patronage to the Royal African Company, and this company would transport more enslaved people from Africa to the Americas than any other single organization in the history of the transatlantic slave trade. The next one was James II. As king, he was the company's largest shareholder until he sold the shares after he was disposed in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. According to historian K.G. Davies in his book, The Royal African Company, James made £6,210 from his investment, equivalent to £1 million today, according to the most conservative estimate. And as we go on, we'll now read about William III and Mary II. So the Dutch Prince William of Orange, a Protestant, supplanted James II, who was Catholic, and he received shares from the Royal African Company from its deputy governor. And historian Dr. Brooke Newman of Virginia Commonwealth University found that William III and Mary II made further wealth from the shares as England's profits from slavery expanded. And now we get to Queen Anne. Queen Anne is remembered for the union of England and Scotland in 1707, which formed the United Kingdom of Great Britain. She also dramatically expanded the nation's slave trading activities by securing from Spain in 1713 the Hacienda de Negros, a monopoly right to supply enslaved African people to Spain's colonies in South America. And then George I. George I was governor of the South Sea Company and held a substantial shareholding. And now we see George II. George II was also a governor and shareholder of the South Sea Company. According to the Slave Voyages database, which has collated records of the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved people, the company took 41,923 African captives on its ships between 1714 and 1740. More than 7,000 people died on the voyages. And then George III. George III wrote as a teenager arguing that slavery had no moral basis, has been cited by some as evidence that the future king was opposed to it, but he supported the continuation of the slave trade and slavery, and opposed the abolition movement behind the scenes, according to research by the historian Brooke Newman for her forthcoming book, The Queen's Silence. And now we get to George IV. His lack of support for the movement to abolish slavery helped to delay emancipation for years. His reign was marked by ruthless suppression of uprisings by enslaved people in the Caribbean. And there is an example of 10 enslaved people who rebelled. They were hanged, then decapitated, and their heads were displayed on spikes. Now, William IV was king at the time when slavery was abolished in 1833, but he had always opposed abolition. Before becoming king, he held the title Duke of Clarence and spent time in the Caribbean, where he befriended plantation owners. So he defended slavery, arguing that it was vital to prosperity, and he argued that enslaved people were comparatively in a state of humble happiness. Clarence House, today's home of King Charles III and Camilla the Queen Consort, was built for William IV in the late 1820s. So this article from the Scotsman says the royal family made its fortune from slave trade. It says the allegations by Meghan Markle that a member of the royal family made racist comments about her child shine a light on a chapter of royal history that the firm would rather forget: their association and profiting from the slave trade. Now pay attention here. It says the restored Stuart dynasty saw slavery as a way to overtake the Dutch as the undisputed masters of the Atlantic Triangle. The Company of Royal Adventures was given a monopoly over most of the west coast of Africa. Listen to this. This was to last 1,000 years. Charles allowed the loan of several ships for the venture. For this, Charles was given 2/3 of all gold mines expropriated. This gave the crown financial independence from Parliament. So the Treaty of Utrecht, which ceded Gibraltar to the UK, also gave Britain the monopoly over the Atlantic slave trade. The fortunes made from this human misery directly benefits the Windsor family today. And that will explain why Charles and William can only express profound sorrow. They're not sorry enough to pay reparations, though. But they know that slavery was the bread and butter for the British monarchs. So we're going to look at this article from history.com, and it's talking about the slave ship Zong, and some of you may know about this massacre. But the Zong left Accra in August of 1781, carrying 442 enslaved Africans bound for the colonial plantations of Jamaica. It says, as was common in the slave trade, the Zong was grossly overcrowded, carrying more than double the amount of people a ship its size could safely transport. Running low on water and having lengthened their journey due to a navigation error, the crew voted to jettison some of its human cargo in order to ensure the safe delivery of the rest, a loss for which the shipping company could be compensated under British law. So listen to this. Over the course of several days, the crew threw at least 122 Africans overboard. The Zong arrived in Black River, Jamaica, with 208 enslaved people on board. So when it went to trial, the Chief Justice in London stated that a massacre of enslaved Africans was the same as if horses had been thrown overboard. So they were not concerned with the fact that they had killed all these people. No, they were more concerned with whether or not the lost cargo, speaking of the people, was covered by insurance. So it says the trial commenced in March of 1783, and the court found that the insurance company was liable for the damages, as enslaved people were the same as any other cargo. 2 months later, the Chief Justice overturned the decision due to new evidence, but his statement that the enslaved were equivalent to horses remained the opinion of Britain's highest court. So it says, formerly enslaved, an abolitionist, Huldah Equiano, told the abolitionist Granville Sharp of the Zong affair, leading Sharp to explore the possibility of having the crew tried for murder. Nothing approaching that level of justice would ever touch those responsible for the massacre, but Sharp and Equiano's efforts to publicize the story did build momentum for the abolitionist movement. So this excerpt from Press Books says, British involvement in the transatlantic slave trade officially began in 1663, when Charles II granted the Royal Company of Merchant Adventurers a monopoly on the transportation of humans from the west coast of Africa to the English colonies in the Americas in a charter that sanctioned the buying and selling, bartering and exchanging of, for and with any Negro slaves, goods, wares, and merchandises whatsoever to be vended or found in Western Africa. Over the next 4 decades, over 300,000 Africans had been enslaved and transported to plantations in the colonies, over 250,000 in British ships. The horror was just the beginning. Continuing on, it says the history of British slavery has been buried, and that is the truth. I can attest to that. I had to do a lot of digging to get information on Britain's role in the slave trade. What you'll find is a lot of information about how they abolished it. But did they really abolish it, or are they trying to improve their image? It says the thousands of British families who grew rich on the slave trade or from the sale of slave-produced sugar in the 17th and 18th centuries brushed those uncomfortable chapters of their dynastic stories under the carpet. Today, across the country, heritage plaques on Georgian townhouses describe former slave traders as West India merchants, while slave owners are hidden behind the equally euphemistic term West India planter. Thousands of biographies written in celebration of notable 17th and 18th century Britons have reduced their ownership of human beings to the footnotes, or else expunged such unpleasant details altogether. It says, the Dictionary of National Biography has been especially culpable in this respect. Few acts of collective forgetting have been as thorough and as successful as the erasing of slavery from Britain's story, or from the Britain's Island story. if it was geography that made this great forgetting possible, what completed the disappearing act was our collective fixation with the one redemptive chapter in the whole story, William Wilberforce and the abolitionist crusade, first against the slave trade and then slavery itself, has become a fig leaf behind which the larger, longer, and darker history of slavery has been concealed. So this article from The Guardian says the history of British slave ownership has been buried. Now its scale can be revealed. So a new BBC documentary told of how a trove of documents laid bare the names of Britain's 46,000 slave owners, including relatives of Gladstone and Orwell. It goes on to say the compensation of Britain's 46,000 slave owners was the largest bailout in British history until the bailout of the banks in 2009. Not only did the slaves receive nothing, under another clause of the Act, they were compelled to provide 45 hours of unpaid labor each week for their former masters for a further 4 years after their supposed liberation. In effect, the enslaved paid part of the bill for their own manumission. So here, you get to pay for your freedom. It says the records of the Slave Compensation Commission are an unintended byproduct of the scheme. They represent a near complete census of British slavery as it was on 1 August 1834, the day the system ended. For that one day, we have a full list of Britain's slave owners, all of them. So it tells how many slaves each of them owned, where those slaves lived and toiled, and how much compensation the owners received for them. Although the existence of the T-71s was never a secret, it was not until 2010 that a team from University College London began to systematically analyze them. The Legacies of British Slave Ownership project, which is still continuing, is led by Professor Catherine Hall and Dr. Nick Draper, and the picture of slave ownership that has emerged from their work is not what anyone was expecting. Another article from The Guardian says the wealth of the West was built on Africa's exploitation. It says Britain has never faced up to the dark side of its imperial history. It says Britain was the principal slaving nation of the modern world. In The Empire Pays Back, a documentary broadcast by Channel 4 on Monday, Robert Beckford called on the British to take stock of the past. Why, he asked, had Britain made no apology for African slavery, as it had done for the Irish potato famine? Why was there no substantial public monument of national contrition, equivalent to Berlin's Holocaust Museum? Why, most crucially, was there no recognition of how wealth extracted from Africa and Africans made possible the vigor and prosperity of modern Britain? Was there not a case for Britain to pay reparations to the descendants of African slaves? It says profits from slave trading and from sugar, coffee, cotton, and tobacco are only a small part of the story. What mattered was how the pull and push from these industries transformed Western Europe's economies. English banking, insurance, shipbuilding, wool and cotton manufacture, copper and iron smelting, and the cities of Bristol, Liverpool, and Glasgow multiplied in response to the direct and indirect stimulus of the slave plantations. So Joseph N. Corey's book, Africans and the Industrial Revolution in England, shows how African consumers, free and enslaved, nurtured Britain's infant manufacturing industry. So Maliki, a political economist, he candidly put it this way in 1745: British trade is a magnificent superstructure of American commerce and naval power on an African foundation. This BBC article confirms that the European slave trade transformed the British economy. It's telling us that the slave trade played an important role in providing British industry with access to raw materials. This contributed to the increased production of manufactured goods. And we have a visual here that's showing us the progression after the South Sea Company was formed. Before then, 80% of British exports was going to Europe. After 1711, the Molasses Act banned import of foreign sugar to North America. By 1750, cotton production became the major British industry. By 1760, Glasgow was the main UK tobacco importer, and in 1800, 60% of British exports would go to Africa and America. And then you see that Bristol, Liverpool, and Glasgow would become major cities. So to deny that they benefited significantly from the pain and suffering of others is showing just how deranged and wicked these people are. But yet they want to make it seem like they were moved with compassion, and that's why they abolished slavery. No. There were some, a small minority in the country, who were fighting against it because of how horrendous it was. But the powers that be in Britain were just as hard-hearted as they are today. This article from The Guardian was written by Michael Taylor, and he said Britain's role in slavery was not to end it, but to thwart abolition at every turn. He says, contrary to our view of history, pro-slavery thinking in the 1820s and 30s was the norm, from politicians to monarchs. And this is why Boris Johnson took offense to the removal of the statues of the British traders. Listen to what he said. He said, to remove offensive statues, whether of Bristolian slave traders or his own heroes, would be to edit or censor our past and to lie about our history. So the author says, but when it comes to slavery and abolition, we have been doing that for centuries. So he says, over the last 10 years, initially as a PhD student, then as a lecturer and scholar, he's been researching two political campaigns of the 1820s and 1830s. The first to abolish colonial slavery, the second to defend it. He said, you may think that these campaigns are well-trodden paths on Britain's national journey, but they are not. For one thing, these campaigns should not be confused with the abolition of the slave trade. Although William Wilberforce ascended to the British pantheon when Parliament abolished the trade in 1807, this did nothing to remedy the plight of the more than 700,000 Africans who remained in bondage in the colonies. It says, at the time, Wilberforce himself declared that before slaves could be fit to receive freedom, it would be madness to attempt to give it to them. So someone would have to be fit to receive freedom. So the author goes on in his scathing report saying it was not until 1823, 16 years later, that the British campaign to emancipate colonial slaves in fact began. Even then it took another 10 years and a great deal of pain, luck, and several momentous slave rebellions to force emancipation through Parliament. The intervening decade, he says, should teach us several important lessons about the truth of British history. So he tells us what the truth is. He says the idea that Britain was first to abolish slavery is laughable nonsense. Revolutionary France abolished slavery in 1794, and Haiti declared it illegal in 1804. He says vast swaths of Spanish America beat Britain to the punch too, even in the United States, where slavery would plunge the Union into crisis in the 1860s. Abolitionism had swept the northern states long before the British campaign for emancipation had even been conceived. So they're gaslighting people. The author says, moreover, as much as we may wish to celebrate the humanitarian aspects of British history, we need to face the uncomfortable truth that until Britons started congratulating themselves for abolishing slavery, it was thought perfectly acceptable to promote the same. Slaveholders such as Edward Colston have become figureheads for today's anti-racism activists, but he and men like him were merely cogs in a much wider machine of oppression, injustice, and brutality which define Britain's relationship with Africa and the Caribbean. In fact, there's a poem called Rule Britannia that was set to music in 1740 that tells us just how arrogant these people are. This article comes from The Sun and it's entitled Rule Britannia Lyrics. What are the words and what is the meaning of the song? So it says Rule Britannia has a distinctive refrain at the end of each verse. The words are Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. It says the song contains lots of symbols of colonialism and racism, especially in the refrain, Rule Britannia, rule the waves, Britons never will be slaves. Critics have said that saying Britons will never be slaves implies that it's okay for others to be enslaved, which is what Brits were doing at the time of its composition in the 18th century. By the 1700s, Britain was exporting half of the world's slaves in the triangular trade, forming much of the base of the British Empire. At the time of the song's release, Liverpool slave ships made around 49 voyages a year, while Bristol's ports averaged at 20. It says slave ship owners and the owners of Caribbean plantations, most of whom lived in Britain, became very wealthy and influential in government and society because of their exploits. The haughty tyrant's lyrics, which has also been blasted, references when Brits would invade foreign lands and call the native people tyrants, perpetuating the outdated concept that Brits are superior to other races and people. Can we think of another group of people who boasted that they had never been enslaved to anyone? Yes, the Edomites. In John 8:33, they said they were Abraham's descendants and they had never been enslaved to anyone. They were correct. They had never been enslaved because they were Edomites. The children of Israel had been enslaved many times, but Yah is not mocked. Whatsoever a man sows, that will he reap. And Revelation 3:10 tells us those who took into captivity will go into captivity. And it's confirmed here in Joel 3:6-8. Also the people of Judah and the people of Jerusalem you have sold to the Greeks, that you may remove them far from their borders. Behold, I will raise them out of the place to which you have sold them, and will return your retaliation upon your own head. I will sell your sons and your daughters into the hand of the people of Judah, and they will sell them to the Sabaeans, to a people far off. So yes, the day will come when Britons will indeed become slaves. Your wicked deeds did not go unnoticed. You made yourselves fat with the wealth you raked in from free labor, but you're going to lose it all. So I hope this message has been a blessing to you. Please remember to hit the like, share it, and you're also welcome to subscribe if you have not already done so. Join me next time. Be blessed, family.